The cafe door slammed open, and the sound cut through the storm like a blade. Sorrel froze mid-breath, her apron strings twisting in her trembling fingers. Rainwater dripped from the man in the doorway, her husband Rylan, his eyes blazing with suspicion and disdain. Behind her, Cassian stood quietly, still wearing the simple apron she had tied around his waist. The billionaire who could have commanded any boardroom now stood in her humble cafe, steady as a pillar, refusing to shrink under Ryland's mocking glare. "You've got to be kidding me," Ryland sneered, his voice sharp enough to slice through the fragile silence. "You're really in here playing housemaid with him?" The words hit Sorrel harder than the thunder outside. Her knees wobbled and her chest tightened as though the storm had moved inside her. For years she had been invisible in her own marriage, reduced to a shadow in the life she helped hold together. But tonight, with Cassian beside her, the weight of invisibility threatened to lift if she dared to make a choice. Cassian didn't shout. He didn't even step forward. He simply met Ryland's eyes and said, in a calm voice that filled the cafe, "She's worth more than you ever let her believe." The silence that followed was unbearable. Sorrel's pulse roared in her ears. This was the moment everything in her life balanced on the edge of a single decision. But before we reach that choice, let me take you back to the nights that led here, to the small rituals, the stolen glances, and the courage Sorrel never knew she had. Welcome, my friends, to Tales by Williams. I want to pray for everyone watching this video. May peace rest on your heart tonight, may your worries grow lighter, and may hope find its way back into your spirit. May you be reminded that you are not alone, that you are worthy of love, and that brighter days are ahead. Amen. Tonight's story is one you won't forget. It's a tale of late nights, unspoken burdens, and a choice that could change a life forever. If you're new here, thank you for joining us. And if you've returned for another story, I'm truly glad you're back. Before we continue, let me ask something simple but important. If you enjoy stories that stir your heart, challenge your thoughts, and make you reflect on your own journey, take a second right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to this channel. That way, you won't miss the next tale we share together. Your support not only fuels this channel, it helps these stories reach more people who might need them. Now think about this. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Perhaps in your home, at work, or even among the people closest to you? That quiet ache of being overlooked, unappreciated, or dismissed. Sorrel knew it well. She carried it every night as she scrubbed floors and stacked chairs long after the world had gone to sleep. Her story doesn't begin with glamour or grand gestures. It begins with exhaustion, with sacrifice, and with a longing to be truly seen. Tonight, you'll walk with her through those silent hours, and you'll witness the moment someone finally noticed her worth. Stay with me, because the choice she faced at midnight could be the very choice you or someone you love will one day face. The decision to remain unseen, or to finally step into the light. Midnight, the hour when the cafe should have been silent, chairs stacked, lights dimmed, doors locked. Instead, the storm outside rattled the windows, and inside, Sorrel stood frozen between two men. On one side, her husband Rylan, jealous, mocking, certain of his control. His words cut at her dignity, each syllable dripping with contempt. On the other, Cassian North, the man no one would expect to see here. A billionaire in a borrowed apron, standing in solidarity with the quiet woman who had carried her world on tired shoulders. This wasn't just an argument. This was a collision of two worlds, one that had diminished her and one that finally honored her. The tension was so sharp you could almost feel the cafe's walls straining to hold it. Cassian didn't raise his voice, yet every word struck like thunder. She deserves more than the shadows you've kept her in. Those words hung heavy, daring Sorrel to believe them. For years she had silenced her own heart. For years she had endured nights of labor while Ryland slept, dismissing her efforts as meaningless. But here, in her small cafe, a man of immense power had lowered himself to her level, not to belittle but to stand beside her. It was in this clash, at this midnight standoff, that the story truly began. And the question that echoes forward is the same one Sorrel faced in that moment. When the world demands you choose, will you cling to what diminishes you, or reach for what finally gives you breath? Not the kind of invisibility where people literally can't see you, but the kind where they choose not to, where your efforts go unnoticed, your sacrifices unappreciated, and your presence taken for granted. Maybe you've poured yourself into a relationship, into a family, into a job, only to realize that the very people who should cherish you barely notice the weight you carry. That was Sorrel's life. Night after night, while the world around her rested, she stayed behind in that small cafe, mopping floors, stacking chairs, scrubbing away the remnants of other people's joy. She didn't complain. She didn't demand thanks. She simply worked, believing her diligence meant something. But at home, her husband dismissed her. The cafe she kept alive with her labor was a joke to him. Her tired hands, her weary smile, her late hours, they all became targets for his mockery. He never saw the quiet strength in her devotion, never honored the persistence that kept her moving. If you've ever stayed late at work without recognition, if you've ever held a family together without thanks, if you've ever sacrificed dreams so others could chase theirs, then you understand Sorrel's heartache. And it is precisely because so many of us have felt that kind of invisibility that her story strikes so deeply, because what Sorrel longed for most was simple and universal: to be seen, to be valued, to be loved not for her utility, but for her soul. Every night followed the same pattern. The cafe emptied, the last customer gone, and Sorrel would stay behind. Her hands were raw from scrubbing, her back stiff from bending, yet she kept moving. The mop swished across the tiles. Chairs scraped as she stacked them one by one. Counters gleamed under her relentless polish. To anyone passing by, she looked like nothing more than a cleaner finishing her shift. But this was more than labor. This was her refuge. The cafe's walls, quiet and steady, were the only place she could exist without judgment. At home, she was dismissed. Here, she was at least in control of her space, even if it demanded every ounce of her strength. Still, the hours were long, the nights lonely. She longed for someone to notice the way she carried herself, the way she poured her heart into the smallest details, for someone to see beyond the apron and the tired eyes. And then, one midnight, a knock at the door shattered the routine. Sorrel turned the sign to close, but the sound pulled her back. Standing outside was Cassian North. Not just a customer, not just a stranger, a man who would step into her world, tie on an apron, and treat her life's work with dignity. That night would set in motion a choice Sorrel had avoided for years, a choice between the comfort of invisibility or the terrifying, liberating leap of finally being seen. The question is, when the moment came, what would she do? The mornings came early for Sorrel, but the nights never seemed to end. By the time dawn crept through the small cracks of her bedroom curtains, she was already on her feet, tidying the remnants of a home she barely felt belonged to her. The dishes from the night before still littered, the sink faint stains of Ryland's late dinners etched into the plates. He never washed them, never thought twice about the weight his habits added to her day. Ryland liked to call himself the provider. He wore that word like a medal, repeating it as though it excused everything else. He earned the paycheck, he reminded her, so she should manage the rest without complaint. And for years Sorrel swallowed her disappointment, tucked her words beneath her tongue, and told herself that silence was safer than confrontation. But silence came at a price. Every sigh that went unnoticed, every weary glance ignored, chipped away at her. She lived in the same house as her husband, but felt like a guest occupying borrowed space. He dismissed her contributions, mocked the cafe where she worked, and ridiculed the hours she poured into keeping it alive. "You're wasting your nights," he would sneer, "scrubbing for pennies." Sorrel never shouted back. Her strength wasn't in loud words, but in quiet endurance. Yet the weight of that endurance bent her shoulders, drained her laughter, and turned the vibrant girl she once had been into a woman worn thin. She longed for the days when she felt light, when her life was colored by dreams instead of drudgery. But those days felt buried under the layers of exhaustion Ryland never even noticed. Evenings were the hardest. After Rylan had eaten and fallen asleep in front of the television, Sorrel would change into her cafe uniform and leave the house. He barely looked up when she slipped out the door, his presence as indifferent as the flicker of the screen. Her footsteps on the quiet street carried her away from the man who should have been her partner but had become her heaviest chain. This was her routine, giving herself away piece by piece while receiving nothing in return. She was not celebrated. She was not supported. She was not even acknowledged. She was a woman married in name but abandoned in spirit. And though she rarely allowed herself the honesty of admitting it, Sorrel felt trapped in a life that didn't see her worth, trapped in a marriage where she played the role of caretaker without ever being cared for, trapped in a cycle of work and dismissal that dulled her to the core. Yet beneath that exhaustion, a faint ember still glowed, a desire not to be invisible, a longing for someone, anyone, to look at her and truly see the weight she carried and the strength it took to bear it. By day, the cafe bustled with ordinary chatter, the hiss of the espresso machine, the soft clink of cups, the low hum of conversation. Customers drifted in for their morning coffee or a quick lunch, and Sorrel smiled as she served them, though her own weariness lingered behind her polite expressions. To many, the cafe was just another place to grab a drink. To Sorrel, it was more complicated. It was her second home, though not one she had chosen freely. Its walls knew her better than her husband did. They had witnessed her exhaustion, her quiet tears, her silent determination. When the last customer left and the lights dimmed, the cafe transformed. The tables, now empty, felt like companions. The worn floor held the imprint of her nightly labor. The scent of roasted beans clung to the air long after she had wiped the counter spotless. In those late hours, when the outside world slipped into slumber, Sorrel finally felt a strange calm. The cafe didn't judge her. It didn't belittle her. It simply existed with her, accepting her presence without demand. But sanctuary came with chains. While the cafe gave her a place of refuge, it also consumed her. She bore the endless labor alone, scrubbing, sweeping, polishing until her body ached. Each chair stacked was another minute of her life drained. Each floor mopped was another reminder that her husband never lifted a hand to help. Rylan's disdain followed her even here. He called her work meaningless, mocked her late hours, and treated the cafe as though it were beneath him. But Sorrel knew better. The cafe was more than work. It was survival. It was the one place where she could shape order out of chaos, where she could feel some control over her world. Still, the paradox was undeniable. The cafe gave her peace even as it stole her strength. It was both haven and burden, both comfort and cage. As she locked the doors at night, the empty tables often seemed to whisper back the questions she tried to silence. How long can you keep this up? How long can you live like this? And though she had no answer, Sorrel always returned the next night, apron tied, sleeves rolled, determined to endure. Sorrel's life was not defined by what she did. It was defined by what went unnoticed. Every sweep of the mop, every dish scrubbed clean, every late-night shift in the cafe was invisible labor. Customers didn't think twice about who polished the counters they leaned on, and Rylan certainly didn't care about the woman who kept both the house and the business running. To the world, Sorrel existed in the background, reliable, quiet, unseen, but beneath her silence lay a yearning she could no longer ignore. She wanted someone to recognize the weight she carried. She wanted someone to notice the small details she obsessed over, the way she wiped the sugar jars until they shone, the way she carefully aligned the chairs, the way she poured herself into every corner of the cafe, as if her soul were stitched into its fabric. At home, she was met with indifference. Rylan's dismissive smirks, his sharp words, his refusal to acknowledge her sacrifices cut deeper than outright cruelty. To be mocked was painful, but to be disregarded, to be treated as though her presence had no value at all, was worse. She often lay awake beside him, staring into the darkness, wondering if she mattered to anyone at all. Her longing was not for riches or status. She didn't crave diamonds or grand gestures. What Sorrel desired was far simpler, the dignity of being seen, of being valued not for what she could provide, but for who she was. That longing became the pulse that kept her going. Each night in the cafe, as exhaustion threatened to swallow her, She clung to the fragile hope that someday someone would pause long enough to look at her and truly see. And when that moment finally came, it would shake the very foundation of the life she thought she was bound to endure. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment to speak directly to you, the listener, the one walking through this story with me. If you've ever felt underestimated, if you've ever carried the weight of responsibilities while others overlooked your efforts, I want you to drop a comment below. Share your experience, because your story matters. This channel isn't just about telling tales. It's about creating a space where voices that were once silenced can finally be heard. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe, because stories like Sorrel's are reminders that even the quietest lives hold power and meaning. Now, back to her world. For Sorrel, the cafe wasn't just walls and chairs. It was the stage where her strength revealed itself night after night, even if no one applauded. The mop became her instrument, the rag her companion, the steady hum of her labor a song no one else could hear. She gave her all to create a place of order, a place where others could find comfort, even as she herself was denied it at home. Yet as steady as her efforts were, the ache of invisibility lingered. Sorrel craved acknowledgement, not in the form of extravagant praise, but in the simple act of being noticed. A thank you, a kind word, a gesture that showed she wasn't just a background figure. The absence of that recognition made each night heavier. Every time she locked the cafe doors, she carried that longing with her, as if the key she turned in the lock pressed it deeper into her chest. She didn't yet know it, but the very place where she felt most unseen was about to become the stage where her worth would finally shine. All it would take was one unexpected knock at midnight, and one man willing to look at her differently. The cafe was finally quiet. Sorrel had stacked the last chair, polished the counter to a soft gleam, and moved toward the door, to flip the sign from open to closed. Her arms ached, but the silence soothed her, a silence she had earned with every sweep of the broom and every scrub of the rag. She was halfway through locking the deadbolt when a knock startled her, sharp but not aggressive. 3 even taps that sent a jolt straight through her chest. Her breath caught. No one ever came this late. She froze, her hand still on the lock, and peered through the glass. A tall man stood outside in the glow of the street lamp. His coat was damp from the drizzle, shoulders squared but not threatening. He didn't hammer the door again. Instead, he waited, patient, as though time itself would bend to his request. Caution tugged at her. The day was over. Her body screamed for rest. Yet something in the way he stood, calm, respectful, almost weary, kept her from turning him away outright. She cracked the door just wide enough to speak through. "We're closed," she said softly, voice barely rising over the patter of rain. He inclined his head, acknowledging her words. "I'm not here for coffee." His tone was steady, low, carrying neither demand nor charm, just an earnestness that surprised her. "I'm here for a little peace." The simplicity of it disarmed her. Not a transaction, not an order barked out with impatience, just peace. A word she longed for herself. Her instincts warned her to shut the door, yet her heart tugged at the edge of hesitation. She studied him, expensive suit visible beneath the unbuttoned coat, polished shoes darkened by rain, features sharp but softened by fatigue. He didn't fit here, not in her modest cafe at midnight, but he didn't seem to be pretending either. "Peace doesn't come in cups," she replied cautiously. "Then I'll take it however it's given," he answered. The faintest curve of his lips suggested gratitude, not persuasion. Against her better judgment, she opened the door wider. "Sit by the window, just for a while. Thank you." His words carried weight, as if she'd offered him far more than a seat. He stepped inside carefully, wiping his shoes on the mat so he wouldn't track water across the floor she had just cleaned. That small gesture, a stranger respecting her labor, sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. She returned to the counter, pretending to busy her hands with the rag. He lowered himself into the corner booth, folding his coat neatly beside him, and simply gazed out at the rain-streaked street. Sorrel risked a glance at him. His posture eased, shoulders no longer rigid, the kind of release that comes when a person finally stops holding the world up. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked steadily. The storm outside softened. When he finally turned to her, his voice was quiet. "You didn't have to open the door. But you did. I won't forget that." Her chest tightened, though she masked it with a small nod. "It's just a chair and a roof. Sometimes," he said, meeting her eyes. "That's everything." The sign outside read closed, but for Sorrel, something had opened. The stranger, Cassian, he had introduced himself after a few minutes, sat quietly, his gaze resting on the worn wood of the table. He seemed content just to breathe in the quiet she had created. Sorrel busied herself behind the counter, wiping the same spot twice, her nerves fraying under the unusual presence. She wasn't used to anyone noticing her this late, let alone sitting still in her space without demands. Then a tray of cups, stacked too high, shifted dangerously near the edge. Sorrel rushed to steady it, but Cassian was faster, catching the wobbling porcelain with a sure grip. He placed the tray down, his expression calm, though his sleeves were now dotted with water from the rinsed cups. "You shouldn't be doing this alone," he said matter-of-fact, not as criticism but as observation. "It's my work," Sorrel replied, her voice firmer than she expected. No one else would bother. His eyes flicked to the apron hanging by the wall, her spare, faded blue from years of use. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Would it help if I wore that?" The suggestion startled her. She had never heard such an offer, not from a customer, and certainly not from Rylan, who mocked even the thought of helping. She followed his gaze to the apron. The idea of someone like him, polished, powerful, wearing it, felt absurd. Yet his expression wasn't mocking, it was careful, almost hesitant. "You don't have to," she said, unsure how to respond. "I'd like to try," he answered simply. She untied the apron from its hook and held it out. He accepted it gingerly, as though he were being entrusted with something valuable. When he slipped the neck loop over his head, the apron fell unevenly against his suit. He fumbled with the ties, clearly unaccustomed to the routine, pulling the strings in the wrong direction, until he gave up with a quiet laugh. "I'm not very good at this," he admitted, a trace of self-deprecation softening his polished exterior. For the first time that night, Sorrel smiled, genuine, unforced. "Turn around," she instructed. He obeyed without protest. She reached for the straps, her fingers brushing the fabric of his coat as she tied the knot with practiced ease. He went still, not stiff with discomfort, but respectful, as though even this small act mattered. When the knot held firm, she gave the strings a light tug. "There," she said, stepping back. Cassian looked down at himself, a billionaire wrapped in an apron meant for late-night cleaning. His laugh was soft, almost embarrassed. "How do I look?" "Like you're about to ruin that suit," she answered, though there was warmth in her tone. "Then I'll have to learn fast," he said. Together they returned to the cups. Cassian copied her movements, rinsing and drying with more care than skill. His hands were steady, his eyes attentive, as if every small task deserved the respect he'd give to signing a contract. When he placed a saucer at the wrong angle, he noticed, corrected it, and gave her a sheepish glance, seeking approval. Sorrel nodded once. "Better." A faint smile crossed his face, the kind that spoke not of victory but of gratitude. The apron hung awkwardly over his frame, the strings slightly crooked, but in that moment it wasn't ridiculous, it was tender. A gesture of humility, a willingness to step into her world not as a guest above her, but as a companion beside her. For Sorrel, it was the first time in years she had tied an apron for someone who truly wanted to share the weight she carried. Cassian's presence at the counter was unlike anything Sorrel had ever experienced. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble and make excuses. When he wasn't sure how to fold the drying cloth, he asked. When he noticed she aligned the handles of the cups in the same direction, he mirrored the detail without question. Every action carried the same unspoken message: your way matters here. That simple truth struck her harder than she wanted to admit. In her marriage, there had never been such patience. Rylan treated the cafe like an embarrassment. He would mock the long hours, laugh at the smell of coffee clinging to her clothes, and remind her that her work didn't amount to much. If she asked him to help sweep or carry crates, he'd roll his eyes and say, "That's your job, not mine." Even the smallest effort from her went unacknowledged. Now, here was Cassian North, whose time could purchase an army of assistants, standing beside her, rinsing spoons and stacking saucers as though the task were important. When he caught a drip of water sliding down his sleeve, he didn't complain about the inconvenience. He just smiled faintly and kept going. At one point, Sorrel dropped a rag. She bent quickly to grab it, but Cassian was faster. He handed it to her without a word, no teasing, no smirk, no reminder of her clumsiness. Just a hand extended with quiet respect. She felt a strange ache in her chest, not because of what he had done, but because of what she suddenly remembered. Rylan would have used the moment to belittle her, tossing out comments that turned small mistakes into heavy stones she carried home. He didn't see her effort. He only saw opportunities to diminish it. Cassian broke the silence gently. "You've put so much care into this place. It shows." She glanced up sharply. "Most people don't notice." "I'm not most people," he replied. His tone wasn't proud. It was factual, spoken with the same steadiness as if he had said, "The floor is clean now." Sorrel swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. No one had ever said those words to her, not in that way. When Cassian finished wiping a counter, he didn't step back with self-congratulation. Instead, he looked to her, waiting for the next task. The question was written in his posture: "What matters to you, and how can I help carry it?" It was such a simple thing, yet to Sorrel, it felt revolutionary. In the back of her mind, Rylan's voice lingered, the sneers, the dismissals, the constant belittling. But standing beside Cassian in the soft light of her cafe, those memories felt weaker, like shadows shrinking under a steadier flame. For the first time in a long while, Sorrel realized how different life could feel when someone treated her presence as valuable, her work as meaningful, her rhythm as worthy of respect. The cafe at midnight became something new with Cassian beside her. The space that usually echoed with her solitary steps now pulsed with quiet rhythm. Two sets of hands moving in tandem, two minds finding harmony in the smallest details. Cassian swept while Sorrel wiped the counters. His strokes weren't perfect, but he mirrored her pattern, adjusting whenever she slowed or shifted. She refilled the sugar jars, and when her hand brushed against his as he steadied one, neither pulled away too quickly. A quiet glance passed between them, acknowledgement, not embarrassment. The air carried no pressure, no performance. Their work together was unspoken conversation. Every time he aligned a cup the way she preferred, it was a wordless statement: "I see you, I respect this." Every time she guided him to the next task, her voice softened, as if the act of instructing him wasn't labor but companionship. A tin of cookies slipped from the shelf, and Cassian caught it with a swift motion. He set it down with care, then chuckled under his breath. "I think your cafe is testing me." "It tests me every night," she replied, the corners of her lips lifting despite herself. For the first time in years, laughter, small, shy, genuine, passed between her and someone who listened. They shared tea as the kettle whistled, standing side by side at the counter. The chipped mugs warmed their hands, and the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was steady, comfortable. Cassian didn't fill it with stories of his wealth or importance. Instead, he asked, "What keeps you here night after night?" Her throat tightened. "It's the only place I feel like I matter. Even if no one notices, at least the cafe remembers me." His gaze was steady. "Then tonight, it's not the cafe remembering you. It's me." The words were simple, spoken without flourish, yet they lingered. Sorrel felt the truth of them in the air around her. As they finished the last task, she retied the apron knot he had loosened in his clumsy attempts. Their closeness felt different now. Not awkward, not forced, but warm, natural, quietly alive. When they turned off the lights, the cafe seemed to sigh into its nighttime rest. At the door, Cassian paused. "Thank you for letting me stay." Her fingers lingered on the lock. "Thank you for helping." He stepped into the damp night, and for the first time in longer than she could recall, Sorrel didn't feel completely alone as she watched the streetlights glow. The first night after the knock, Cassian returned precisely at midnight. No entourage, no driver waiting at the curb, just a man in a dark coat with rain on the sleeves and a softness in his eyes that didn't match his reputation. Sorrel pretended not to expect him, though she caught herself straightening the sugar jars a little earlier than usual. He greeted her with the kind of nod that says, "Thank you for letting me come back." She handed him a clean cloth, and without ceremony he moved to the front windows. They worked in companionable quiet, not afraid of silence but not ruled by it either. When he smudged a corner of glass, he noticed before she did and re-wiped it without a word. That was their rhythm. She tended, he learned. She instructed, he listened. On the second night, a streetlight flickered over the awning. The cafe felt like a secluded harbor in a city that didn't sleep. Cassian took the broom without asking. Sorrel tracked the inventory of beans with a stubby pencil, lips moving soundlessly as she counted. When she glanced up, he was sweeping in patient arcs, careful to corral the dust toward the pan rather than scatter it. He missed a strip near the counter and caught it on the return pass, a small correction that pleased him more than it should. She noticed his satisfaction and hid a smile by wiping the espresso wand again. By the third night, their greetings loosened. Cassian asked about the music she preferred when no one was around. She admitted she liked strings, something steady that didn't drown out thought. He didn't pull out a phone to play his own set. He simply said, "I can hear it anyway," and went back to aligning cups by handle direction. A gentleman in a suit, clearly out late, knocked on the glass and gestured for service. Sorrel shook her head, mouthing closed, and tapped the sign. The man rolled his eyes and walked off. Cassian didn't comment, but the crease between his brows deepened. He returned to the counter and quietly polished the drip tray, as if protecting her boundary was something he could do with a cloth and patience. Night 4 brought small talk that wasn't small. Sorrel asked whether he ever got bored at the top. He said boredom wasn't the trouble, emptiness was. Rooms full of people who want something but not the truth. He surprised himself by saying it out loud and, for a beat, looked like he might regret it. Sorrel didn't prod. She only nodded and handed him the container of wooden stirrers. 4 bundles, handles facing out, she said. He grinned faintly. My favorite test. They developed tiny rituals. He carried the trash out in the final 15 minutes. She rechecked the back latch. He tapped the bell once to see if it still chimed clean. She signed the ledger. When a chair leg wobbled, he knelt and tightened the bolt with a coin from his pocket. He rose, wiping his hands, and only then did he say, "You shouldn't have to wrestle your furniture." She answered, "It listens better when I'm not alone." Laughter came slowly, like a cautious animal stepping into open air. On night 5, he misread her note close milk as close mind in the ledger. "Orders from management?" he asked dryly. Sorrel startled, then laughed, a short, bright sound that surprised them both. He smiled wide, less polished than usual, and confessed he hadn't laughed like that in weeks. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear to hide the warmth rising in her cheeks. They didn't swap life stories. They traded details. He liked his tea plain, no lemon. She preferred her sleeves rolled to the elbow because cuffs caught on the edges of trays. He counted steps when he was tense. 8 from front door to counter, 10 to the cooler, 3 to the sink. She hummed when anxious, only a thread of melody, barely audible. He pretended not to notice, and in that pretending, he honored the privacy she guarded. On night 6, a fuse clicked in the back room and half the lights dimmed. Sorrel reached for the panel with an instinct born of repetition. Cassian stepped back, letting her lead her own domain. When the lights snapped fully on again, he offered a tiny clap of approval. "A master at work," he said. "A worker at work," she corrected. He tilted his head. "Those are not the same?" She held his gaze. "They are when you do it with care." Their laughter became easier, their pauses less loaded. Sorrel found herself speaking in full sentences instead of fragments. Cassian stood a little closer, but never close enough to crowd her. When he misbuttoned the neck loop of the apron on night 7, she fixed it with quick fingers. "You have a way of making ordinary things feel respectable," she said, then looked away, unsure if she'd said too much. He answered, "Only because you made them matter first." The nights stitched themselves into a quiet sequence, rain against glass, the soft clatter of cups, the scrape of chair legs settling perfectly into place. No grand declarations, just small gestures done well, conversation that allowed breath, laughter that arrived as relief. Sorrel didn't mark the moment when Cassian moved from stranger to presence. She only noticed that when midnight came, her shoulders didn't immediately lift toward her ears. The work no longer felt like a sentence. It felt like a ritual that finally had 2 sets of hands. When he left each night, he paused with his hand on the door, glancing back not to be dramatic but to be sure she was all right. She lifted the ledger in a modest salute. He answered with that half-smile she had learned to expect. The bell chimed once, clear and sure, and the street swallowed him. Sorrel would stand with the deadbolt under her palm and realize that for the first time in years, she didn't dread the walk home. Something had shifted, not a leap, not a blaze, just a steady warming, the kind that lasts. On the 8th night, the rain had stopped, but the city outside remained restless. Sorrel polished the counter in slow circles while Cassian dried the last set of cups. Their silence was comfortable until he broke it, not with a casual remark, but with a thought that sounded as though it had weighed on him for years. "Do you know what people expect of me?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. "To walk into a room and own it, to make decisions that ripple through thousands of lives, to keep everything moving no matter the cost." Sorrel glanced at him. His hands continued their work, but his shoulders were taut, his jaw tight. "I do it," he continued, "because that's what's required. But in those rooms, no one looks at me the way you do. They don't see a man, they see an emblem of what they want or what they fear. Nothing more." He placed the cup carefully on the drying rack, as though the motion steadied him. "I've sat at tables so polished you can see your reflection in them, surrounded by men who smile without, meaning women who nod before I finish a sentence. And yet, in all that noise, I've never felt more hollow." Sorrel paused, cloth in hand, caught between surprise and recognition. She knew the ache of invisibility in her own life, but to hear it from someone who lived among towers of power startled her. "You feel unseen," she said softly. He looked at her, eyes shadowed with fatigue. "Exactly. Wealth builds walls. Titles build cages. The higher you climb, the more people stop speaking to you like you're human. They want decisions, outcomes, signatures, not truth, not company." Cassian's expression eased, if only slightly. "Here I stack chairs and Polish spoons. No one claps, no one negotiates, no one flatters. It's the first place in years where silence feels honest." The admission hung between them, fragile but real. Sorrel searched his face, not for the glamour that others saw, but for the man who now stood in a simple apron, confessing emptiness. She realized then that his visits weren't about novelty. They weren't about charity or curiosity. He came because her world, plain and unadorned, gave him something the boardrooms never could, a place without pretense. "Strange, isn't it?" he added with a faint, self-conscious smile. "The only time I feel grounded is when I'm wiping counters in a cafe I don't own." She shook her head gently. "It's not strange. It just means you're human." The truth of it seemed to settle into him like warmth. He gave a small nod, not in agreement with her words, but in acknowledgement of the relief they brought. They returned to their tasks, quieter now, but it was a different kind of quiet. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of what had been spoken. Sorrel could sense that Cassian wasn't used to sharing such thoughts aloud. Yet here, among the smell of coffee grounds and the squeak of chair legs, he had risked it. And in that risk, something shifted. Their work no longer felt like a practical routine. It became a ritual of trust, one cloth stroke and one confession at a time. It was the 9th night when Sorrel allowed herself to share more than instructions about cleaning cloths and closing checklists. The cafe was nearly ready for lock-up, the lights dimmed to a mellow glow. Cassian was aligning the stirrers in their holders with the precision she had taught him, while Sorrel leaned against the counter, the ledger open but her pen motionless. She watched him work in silence before speaking, her voice soft but firm. "Do you know why I never leave this place early? Why I stay long after it should be closed?" Cassian glanced up, sensing the gravity in her tone. He didn't answer, only gave her space to continue. "This cafe isn't just a job," she said. "It's the only part of my life that belongs to me." He set the stirrers down, folded his hands on the counter, and waited. "My husband," Sorrel continued, tasting the weight of each word, "tells me this place is a joke. He says the hours I pour into it mean nothing. He sneers at me for staying late, for polishing, for stacking every chair until it's exact. He tells me it doesn't matter because I don't matter." Her eyes dropped to the pen in her hand. "So when I come here at night, it isn't only to clean, it's to breathe, to remember that even if no one else cares, these chairs will stand straight because I place them. These floors will shine because I scrub them. In this small space I exist without his voice tearing me down." Cassian's jaw tightened, but he remained still. He didn't rush to console her or interrupt. He simply absorbed her words, his silence an invitation for her to continue. "He sleeps at home while I'm here," she said, her throat tightening. "He never lifts a hand to help, never asks how the day was, never notices how tired I am. Sometimes I wonder if he even sees me at all. But when I'm here, the cafe sees me, the work sees me. Even if he doesn't." For a moment she feared she had said too much, that she had revealed a wound too raw. But when she lifted her gaze, Cassian's eyes were steady, not pitying, not judgmental, just steady. "You shouldn't have to fight to exist," he said quietly. His words landed with the weight of truth, not flattery. She felt her chest ache, not from pain but from the shock of being acknowledged. "This place isn't perfect," she admitted, brushing her thumb across the ledger's corner. "It's small, it's exhausting, but it's mine. And when I'm here, I can almost believe I'm more than what he says I am." Cassian leaned back slightly, his voice calm but resolute. "You are more." The simple certainty in his tone pressed against the cracks in her heart. Sorrel closed the ledger slowly, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like her truth had been brushed aside. She didn't feel mocked. She felt heard. 10th night brought a stillness that felt almost fragile. The cafe had been emptied for hours, the smell of coffee faint in the air, the counters gleaming from Sorrel's cloth. Cassian was sweeping near the door when his hand brushed hers as she set the sugar jar down. A brief contact, no longer than a breath. Yet the moment tightened something in the air, as though time itself had paused to notice. Sorrel drew her hand back, cheeks warming, but she didn't scold herself. Instead, she focused on the way Cassian had frozen too, as if aware that the smallest touch could speak volumes when words were scarce. Neither acknowledged it aloud, but both felt its echo. Later that night, as she unlocked the cookie tin to refill the jar, Cassian leaned against the counter, eyes following her with quiet curiosity. She pulled out two, slightly overbaked on the edges but still fragrant with butter and sugar. She slid one across to him. He blinked, almost amused. "Is this part of the training?" "Only for the dedicated," she said, her lips curling in a faint smile. He took the cookie, broke it neatly in half, and handed a piece back to her. "Then I'd say it's fair we share." They ate in silence, crumbs catching in the soft light, the act as intimate as any candle at dinner. Sorrel wasn't sure why it felt so different, but perhaps it was because this wasn't grand or staged. It was ordinary, and yet deeply personal. As they worked side by side afterward, their glances began to stretch a little longer. Cassian looked at her not as if she were invisible, nor as if she were fragile, but as though she were worth the full measure of his attention. When she caught him watching, she would glance away, but the faint upward tug of her mouth betrayed her. One night, the rag slipped from her hand as she reached across the counter. Cassian picked it up at the same time she did, their fingers pressed together over the damp cloth, neither retreating for a heartbeat longer than necessary. When she finally pulled back, the warmth lingered, a quiet reminder of connection. On another evening, he misjudged the chair stack, the legs scraping awkwardly. Sorrel laughed, a light, surprised sound. He grinned back, mock bowing an apology, and the two of them ended up laughing together, the sound ringing through the empty cafe like a forgotten melody. The moments weren't loud or dramatic. They were small and unassuming, but they wove a thread between them that tightened each night. With every brush of hands, with every cookie shared, with every glance that held just a second too long, Sorrel felt a truth taking root. She wasn't invisible here. She wasn't mocked, dismissed, or belittled. She was seen. Not with pity, not with obligation, but with respect and warmth. And in Cassian's steady gaze, she found a reflection of something she had nearly lost in herself: worth. By the 11th night, the cafe felt less like a workplace and more like a shared ritual. The tasks never changed: wiping counters, stacking chairs, refilling jars. But the presence beside Sorrel did. Cassian's quiet consistency became its own comfort, something she looked forward to even before the clock struck midnight. Yet, even with the rhythm they built, the question lingered: could she trust it? Trust him? Trust that his presence wasn't fleeting or self-serving? Sorrel had lived too long with disappointment to give her faith easily. One evening, as she poured the last of the milk into the cooler, she found herself asking aloud, "Why keep coming back?" Cassian set down the broom and looked at her without hesitation. "Because this is the first place I've felt honest in years." The answer startled her, not for its boldness, but for its simplicity. He wasn't there to impress. He wasn't there to rescue. He was there because in her company, the walls he carried elsewhere seemed to fall away. Sorrel's throat tightened with a mix of relief and fear. Relief that someone finally valued her world. Fear of believing it too much. She busied herself with the ledger, unwilling to let him see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. For a moment, only the storm outside filled the silence. Then Cassian spoke again. "You've given me something no one else could, a place where I can just be a man sweeping a floor." Her lips curved despite herself. "And do you sweep well enough to keep the job?" He laughed, genuine and unguarded. "You'd tell me." That laughter carried through the cafe, wrapping around Sorrel like a warmth she hadn't known in years. And in that sound she felt the weight of choice pressing closer. Not the choice of leaving or staying with Rylan, not yet, but the choice to trust that this quiet companionship might be real. And now, to you watching this story unfold, would you have trusted Cassian? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you're hooked. Your voice matters here. Every comment, every share, every subscription helps these stories reach the people who need them most. Cassian lifted the mop bucket, sloshing the last of the soapy water into the back drain. Sorrel watched him, struck by the absurdity of it all. A man who commanded skyscrapers and fortunes choosing instead to learn the rhythm of her cafe. Yet absurdity had never felt so steady, so true. When he left that night, pausing as always with his hand on the door, Sorrel found herself asking silently, if trust is built in small pieces, night after night, is this how it begins? She locked the door behind him and pressed her hand against the cool glass. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent, but for the first time in years she didn't feel quite so small against it. Someone had seen her. Someone had chosen to return. And maybe, just maybe, that meant she could begin choosing herself too. Midnight pressed its cold hand against the cafe windows. Rain ran in swift rivers down the glass, quivering under gusts that rattled the bell over the door. Sorrel stood alone at the counter, steadying her breath, the closing checklist half finished. The air felt charged, as if the night itself held its breath with her. She'd done this closing ritual 1,000 times, wipe the machines, dry the cups, align the sugar jars, note the orders for morning. But tonight the movements felt heavier. The storm outside wasn't just weather, it sounded like a memory knocking, a warning drumming in the gutters, a chorus of all the swallowed words she'd carried home for years. Cassian set the last chair upside down on the table and paused. "You good?" he asked, voice low, respectful of the hush they'd built together. His shirt sleeves were rolled, the borrowed apron tied neatly at his back. He belonged here, not because this was his world, but because he treated it like it mattered. "I'm fine," Sorrel said, and felt the lie sit on her tongue. She wasn't fine. She was a breath away from something she couldn't name yet. A long, jagged rip of thunder rolled across the rooftops. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Cassian glanced toward the windows. "We should lock up," he said. "Storm's not easing." Sorrel nodded and moved toward the door. The night pressed in close, rain hammering the pavement, the street empty, the awning shivering with each gust. She reached for the sign to flip it to closed. The moment her fingers grazed the card, the bell gave a small nervous jingle. She stilled. No one stood outside. "It's the wind," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She flipped the sign anyway and slid the deadbolt. The bell quieted. The cafe returned to its small symphony, the faint hum of the fridge, water scudding along the curb outside, the soft scrape of cloth against the counter as Cassian finished a last swipe. He put the cloth down and leaned an elbow on the counter's edge, not casual, not familiar, just near enough to steady the space. "Tell me what you need," he said. He always asked that way. Not "can I fix this?" Not "here's what you should do." Just a simple question that gave her control. She drew in a breath and pulled the apron strings tighter at her waist. "I need the night to end," she said. "And I need it to end with something different in me than what I started with." Cassian nodded once. "Then we'll end it well." They moved through the last motions, wiping a final ring of moisture from a table, brushing away a stray crumb, checking the back latch. Sorrel's hands shook as she noted the milk level for morning. She set the pen down. The rain thickened, thrashing against the glass with renewed force. A drumbeat that matched the thud of her pulse. A single car rolled by, tires hissing through the flooded street. Headlights washed over the front windows and slid away. Darkness returned, warm and contained within the cafe's walls, a pocket of light held against the storm. Sorrel stood facing the door, sensing an arrival she couldn't justify. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from logic, but from years of knowing exactly how trouble announces itself. Cassian followed her gaze. "Do you want me to stay a little longer?" he asked. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. He stayed. The bell still waited above the door. The deadbolt sat firm. But the storm refused to quiet, and in its relentless rhythm the night felt like a mirror. Everything churning outside had a twin inside her. Fear, courage, the urge to retreat, the urge to step forward. She pressed her palm flat to the counter to steady herself. "Whatever comes," Cassian said softly, as if he'd read her posture, "you're not alone." Outside, a shape moved past the window. Quick, a smear of shadow and rain. Sorrel didn't breathe. The shape halted, turned back, stopped directly in front of the door. The bell did not ring. Not yet. But the night had chosen its moment. The silence broke in an instant. The door jerked against the deadbolt once, then again, harder. Before Sorrel could react, the metal gave a sharp snap, and the cafe bell clanged violently. Ryland shoved his way inside, dripping with rain, his coat flung half open, his scowl carved deep as if the storm itself had carried him in. His eyes darted first to Sorrel, then to Cassian, and narrowed with a sneer that made her chest tighten. "So this is where you've been wasting your nights," he spat. "Playing housemaid with a stranger?" Sorrel stepped back, pressing her hand against the counter. Her throat tightened. The storm outside still roared, but it was Ryland's presence that filled the room with thunder. Cassian didn't move at first. He stood calm near the counter, sleeves rolled, apron tied, as if he were part of the place rather than an intruder. His stillness contrasted Ryland's chaos in a way that made the difference between them undeniable. Ryland barked a laugh, sharp and ugly. "Look at you," he jeered, pointing at Cassian's apron. "A suit-wearing clown, mopping floors like you belong here. Do you know how ridiculous you look?" Cassian didn't answer. His silence was its own weapon. Ryland swung his gaze back to Sorrel. "And you, this is what you've reduced yourself to? Scrubbing till midnight with some stranger? You've always embarrassed me, but this is pathetic." Each word struck her like a lash. For years, his voice had been the one she obeyed, the one that kept her small. But tonight, with Cassian beside her, The words landed differently. They still hurt, but they no longer sank so deep. Cassian finally spoke, tone level, unhurried. "You came in here to shout," he said, eyes steady on Rylan. "But all I hear is fear." Rylan's mouth twisted. "Fear? Of her?" He jabbed a finger toward Sorrel. "She's nothing without me, nothing." The cafe seemed to shrink around them, the storm hammering the windows in agreement with every cruel word. Sorrel wanted to speak, but her voice stayed locked behind her teeth. Her heart pounded so loud she thought they both could hear it. Cassian took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just steady, like a man grounding the space. "You don't get to decide her worth," he said quietly. "You never did," Rylan scoffed, shaking his head. "And you think you do? What are you, her savior?" "No," Cassian replied. "I'm a man who sees her." The words fell heavy in the small cafe, louder than Rylan's shouts, louder than the storm outside. Sorrel's chest rose in a quick breath, her hand tightening on the edge of the counter until her knuckles ached. Rylan's glare shifted between them, his jaw flexing, his control slipping like water through a fist. He had expected obedience. He had expected shame. Instead, he faced a silence that refused to bend. The storm rattled the glass again, but it was clear the real collision wasn't outside, it was here, inside the cafe, where Sorrel stood between the man who mocked her existence and the man who treated it with honor. And the night had only just begun to test her. Rylan's laughter rang harshly through the cafe, echoing off the empty tables. He spread his arms wide as though claiming the whole room. "Look at this little stage you've built," he sneered at Sorrel. "You think these nights mean anything? You think he cares?" He jerked his thumb at Cassian. "The moment he's bored, he'll vanish, and you'll still be here, wiping crumbs like you always do." Sorrel's breath caught, her chest tightening. For so long, these words had been her reality: dismissal, contempt, the assurance that she would never be enough. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Cassian stepped forward then, unhurried but certain. He didn't tower over Rylan, didn't flare his voice into a shout. Instead, he carried his strength like a steady flame, quiet but impossible to ignore. He stood between Sorrel and Rylan, not blocking her but anchoring her. "She's worth more than you ever taught her to believe," Cassian said. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They landed with the force of truth, cutting through the storm and silencing even Rylan's mockery. For a moment, only the rain answered. Rylan blinked, his sneer faltering, then hardened again. "Worth more? Don't talk to me about worth. I'm the one who gave her a home. I'm the one who—" Cassian raised a hand slightly, not commanding, just stopping the noise. His eyes stayed locked on Rylan's, calm and unwavering. "You didn't give her anything, you took. Her strength built this. Her labor keeps it standing. Her heart made this place alive. You only ever claimed what was already hers." Sorrel's knees trembled. Her whole body felt caught between collapse and freedom. She had waited years to hear someone speak those words, words she had whispered to herself in the dark but never dared to voice aloud. Rylan scoffed, though it lacked conviction now. "You don't know her. You've been here what, days, weeks? You don't know who she is." Cassian's reply was simple, firm. "I know enough. I know she deserves respect. I know she deserves more than ridicule. And I know she deserves to choose for herself who she stands beside." The air thickened, every sound magnified. The steady tick of the wall clock, the hammer of rain against glass, the faint creak of Sorrel's hand tightening on the counter. Rylan stepped closer, face inches from Cassian's. "You think you're better than me? That you can just walk in here and—" Cassian didn't flinch. His voice stayed even, cutting clean through Rylan's fury. "I don't need to be better than you. I only need to be true to her." The storm outside lashed harder against the windows, as though echoing the tension inside. Sorrel's throat burned, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. This was no longer just about the cafe. It was about years of silence meeting a voice strong enough to call out her worth. Rylan's fists clenched, but his words faltered, because for the first time he wasn't the loudest presence in the room. Cassian's calm had filled the cafe with something stronger than anger. It had filled it with truth. The cafe seemed to shrink to a single heartbeat. The rain outside slammed against the windows, thunder rolled far above, yet inside, everything was unbearably still. Sorrel's breath trembled in her chest, shallow and uneven. Her hands gripped the counter edge as though it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Ryland's voice still hung in the air, dripping with contempt. Cassian's words lingered too, steady, calm, unshakable. Between them stretched a silence that grew heavier with each second, pressing down on Sorrel until she thought her ribs would crack. She wanted to speak, but her throat refused. For years she had trained herself into quiet. Every time Ryland had mocked her work, she had swallowed her protests. Every time he'd belittled her late nights, she'd bitten her tongue. Every time she'd wanted to scream that she mattered, she'd instead turned back to the mop, the rag, the endless labor. Silence had been her survival. But tonight, silence hurt. Her eyes darted to Cassian. He wasn't urging her. He didn't push or plead. He simply waited, hands at his sides, gaze fixed not on Ryland but on her. He was giving her the space to choose, not for him, not against her husband, but for herself. Her gaze shifted to Ryland. His sneer had hardened into something else now, impatience, frustration, a desperate attempt to maintain control. He snapped his fingers toward the door. "Let's go, now. Enough of this game." The words hit her like a chain thrown across her shoulders. Her body shook. She wanted to obey, to keep the peace, to fall back into the familiar trap of compliance. That path was worn, known, safe in its misery. Yet another part of her, small, timid, but alive, ached for something different. It whispered in her chest, asking if maybe, just maybe, she deserved more than invisibility. The silence lengthened. The storm outside seemed to fade as all her focus narrowed to this one impossible moment. Her throat tightened with unshed tears. Her palms burned from gripping the counter too hard. She felt the weight of years pressing on her back, holding her down, demanding she stay small. Her body trembled, torn between obedience and freedom. Every second stretched like an eternity. The cafe clock ticked, marking time that seemed cruel in its insistence. Finally, Sorrel released her grip on the counter. Her hands fell limp at her sides. She inhaled, sharp and shaky, and her knees nearly gave beneath her. Both men waited, the storm raging behind them, the silence raging between them. This was no longer just about a cafe, or an apron, or even a marriage. This was about the right to exist as someone seen, someone valued, someone free. But to claim that, Sorrel had to break her silence. The pause stretched 1 second longer, then another, until the air itself seemed ready to shatter. The storm outside rattled the glass so hard it seemed the cafe itself might splinter, but inside, Sorrel stood in stillness. Her fingers drifted to the apron knotted at her waist, the cloth damp with hours of labor. That apron was more than fabric. It was years of endurance, years of sacrifice, years of invisibility. Her husband's command still rang in her ears. "Let's go. Now." His words cracked like a whip, expecting her to flinch, to obey, to fold herself small once more. Cassian's words echoed too, gentler but no less powerful. "She's worth more than you ever taught her to believe." He hadn't begged her to stay. He hadn't demanded she choose him. He had only offered her the truth, leaving the decision in her hands. Her hands trembled as she tugged at the knot. The strings resisted at first, tight from being tied too firmly. She pulled again. The knot gave. Slowly, deliberately, she slipped the apron free and laid it across the counter. The sound of cloth against wood was louder than thunder. Ryland's sneer faltered, then twisted into fury. "What is this supposed to mean?" he barked. "You think you're proving something? You'll regret this, Sorrel. You always come crawling back." But she didn't move toward him. She didn't cower. She stood with her shoulders trembling but upright, her voice finally finding air. "You never saw me," she whispered. The words wavered, but they carried more strength than any shout she had ever given. "But he does." The cafe bell clattered violently as Ryland shoved the door open, storming out into the rain. The sound rang through the small space, then faded into the night, leaving only the quiet thrum of water against the roof. For a long moment, Sorrel stayed frozen, her hands resting on the counter where she'd placed the apron. Her chest heaved, her throat burned, her whole body shook with the weight of what she had just done. Cassian stepped closer, but not to claim her, not to celebrate a victory. He simply stood near enough to steady her, his presence warm, patient, unwavering. "You don't have to say anything," he murmured. "Just breathe," so she did. For the first time in years, Sorrel filled her lungs without fear that someone would cut the air short. The storm still raged, but inside the cafe, something new began, the fragile quiet of freedom. The door crashed back against the frame, rattling the bell until it went silent. Ryland's footsteps pounded into the rain and faded down the street, swallowed by water and wind. For the first time all night, the cafe felt truly still. Sorrel didn't move. Her hands rested on the counter where she'd set the apron, fingers splayed as if anchoring herself to something solid. The fabric lay quiet, a small flag of surrender to no one, only a marker that the labor of being ignored was over. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears, slowing little by little. The storm outside kept hammering the awning, but inside the air softened. The walls no longer pressed in. The familiar hum of the fridge sounded almost kind. She tried to swallow and found her throat tight. This was the moment she used to fear, the fallout, the aftermath, the second after defiance when doubt comes searching for a foothold. She waited for panic. It didn't arrive. What came instead was a cautious stillness, like the body discovering it can stand without bracing. Her gaze drifted to the door again. No return footsteps, no second entrance, just rain. She drew one breath, then another, a little deeper each time. Her knees trembled, but they held. Not the rigid strength of someone pretending, the real kind, the kind that shakes and stands anyway. A chair near the window sat half-turned, a small imperfection in a room she kept precise. She reached for it on instinct, set its legs square, and felt a strange, fragile pride bloom in her chest. The room did not need to be perfect tonight, but she did want it to be hers. Behind her, the kettle clicked as its metal cooled. A curl of steam rose and thinned. The little sound marked time better than the wall clock, before the door slam, after the door slam. 2 lives separated by a bell and a choice. In the glass of the front window, her reflection looked back, hair damp around the temples, eyes rimmed with red, shoulders unbowed. She barely recognized the woman in the pain, and yet she knew her. This was the version of herself that had been waiting beneath the late shifts and the quiet endurance. Not fearless, free enough to begin. She brushed her palm across the counter once, the way she always did at closing, but this time not to erase a stain, this time to say goodbye to the way things were. The night exhaled. So did she. Sorrel kept her eyes fixed on the counter, afraid that if she looked anywhere else her resolve might crumble. Her chest still rose and fell too quickly, each breath edged with the memory of Ryland's voice. She didn't notice Cassian move until his reflection joined hers in the window. He stood a step behind, not crowding, not reaching, just present. His hands remained loose at his sides, his posture calm, as though he understood that any sudden motion might shatter the fragile balance she had just found. "You don't have to speak," he said softly. His voice was steady, grounding. "Not tonight, not until you're ready." Tears stung at the corners of her eyes, though she hadn't wanted to cry. For so long, her emotions had been weaponized, mocked, twisted, used as proof of weakness. But here she didn't feel judged. The tears were simply hers. Cassian moved closer, slow and deliberate, until he stood near enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. He didn't touch her. He didn't try to turn her toward him. Instead, he leaned one hand lightly on the counter, mirroring her stance, sharing her silence. Minutes stretched, and the storm eased into a gentler rain. Sorrel finally released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The sound was shaky but real. Only then did Cassian speak again. "Strength isn't loud," he said. "It's what you just did. Standing there when it would have been easier to fold." Her shoulders sagged, but not from defeat. From release. The words didn't come to her yet, but she let her head bow slightly, a small acknowledgement that she had heard him, that his presence mattered. When her knees wobbled, Cassian lifted a hand, not to hold her but to hover near, an offer without demand. She steadied herself before she leaned into it, finding her balance on her own. His hand lowered again, the gesture withdrawn as quietly as it had been offered. It was respect, she realized, the rarest kind. He wasn't trying to replace her chains with new ones. He wasn't here to claim her victory as his. He was simply a witness, steady, patient, willing to stand in the space she had carved open for herself. For the first time in years, Sorrel didn't feel like someone else's shadow. She felt like herself. The cafe was quiet the following morning, but Sorrel felt its silence differently now. Once the walls had pressed against her like a cage, the endless rows of chairs and counters tying her to a cycle of exhaustion. Now, as she walked through the familiar space, it no longer felt like home. It felt like a chapter closing. She trailed her hand over the counter, the same one she had wiped down 1,000 times. Each stain, each scratch told the story of long nights endured alone. Yet instead of sorrow, she felt gratitude. This was where she had learned the difference between surviving and living, where she had discovered her strength. When she flipped the sign for the last time, she didn't cry. She simply stood straighter. The rain had stopped and a pale dawn stretched across the street. Sorrel stepped out, leaving the heavy key on the counter behind her. Days turned into weeks, and with Cassian's quiet encouragement but never interference, Sorrel began to dream differently. Not of a life where she merely kept things polished for others, but of a space that carried her own fingerprint. She found a small storefront in a livelier part of town, its windows wide and sunlit. Instead of scrubbing someone else's grime, she painted walls with bold colors. She replaced uniform tables with mismatched pieces she chose herself. And on the back counter, she left room not just for coffee, but for sketchbooks, brushes, and small displays of art from local creators. It was more than a cafe. It was a studio, a gathering place, a reflection of her own creativity. People didn't just stop by for drinks, they lingered to talk, to draw, to breathe. And when Sorrel walked through this new space, she felt no weight pressing down. Each corner carried her name. Cassian visited often, not as a patron expecting service, but as someone who belonged quietly in the rhythm she had built. He hauled in canvases, moved tables when she needed space, or sometimes just sat with a notebook, content to share the room without demanding her attention. The old cafe had been her prison. This new one was her declaration. She was more than someone's helper, more than someone's burden. She was the heart of a place built on freedom. In her new cafe studio, Sorrel found herself surrounded by a kind of freedom she had never known before. Yet even freedom carried moments of fear. Would people come? Would her vision be enough? These doubts crept in during the quieter hours, when the paint smell still lingered and the chalkboard menu looked too clean, too empty. Cassian never swooped in with grand gestures to erase her worries. He didn't write checks to solve problems or make decisions in her place. Instead, he listened. When she stayed up late adjusting sketches for the cafe's sign, he sat across from her with a mug in hand, nodding when she spoke, asking questions that reminded her the choices were hers. "Your way works," he'd say simply. "Trust it." When customers trickled in for the first time, Cassian carried trays alongside her, but he didn't step in front. He moved as if the floor belonged to her, as though he was a guest in her dream, honored to help but careful never to claim it. The difference between him and Rylan was stark. Rylan had belittled her efforts, calling them useless or small. Cassian, by contrast, celebrated the details she often overlooked. He admired the brushstrokes on her hand-painted signs, complimented the mismatched mugs she collected, and noticed how her choice of music softened the space. Where Rylan saw chores, Cassian saw artistry. In quiet evenings, when the cafe lights dimmed and the last chairs were tucked in, Sorrel sometimes found herself pausing in the doorway, watching him. He'd be sweeping the floor or adjusting a chair leg, moving with no expectation of reward. She realized then that his presence wasn't about saving her. It was about respecting her enough to join in the work, to share the weight without taking away her control. He had wealth, power, influence, yet in her cafe, he never led with any of it. Instead, he led with humility. He was a man who had chosen to be part of something that wasn't his, and that made all the difference. For Sorrel, this partnership was the truest gift. Not a man to rescue her, but a man willing to stand beside her, steady and sure, while she learned to rescue herself. The cafe was finally quiet. The last light over the counter glowed soft and golden, throwing gentle shadows across the sketches pinned to the wall. Sorrel leaned against the counter, exhaustion pressing into her bones, but it was the kind of tired that came with fulfillment, not emptiness. Cassian stacked the final chair, brushing a bit of dust from his sleeves. "It looks different every time I come in," he said lightly. "Like it's still becoming something new." Sorrel smiled faintly. "Maybe because I'm still becoming something new." He paused at that, the weight of her words settling between them. For a long moment neither spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was alive, threaded with all the hours they had shared in quiet companionship. Cassian walked toward her, slow, measured, as though asking permission with every step. He stopped close enough that she could feel his presence, but still far enough to leave her choice intact. His eyes searched hers, steady and unhurried. "You don't owe me anything," he said softly. "Not thanks, not promises. Just know that I'll be here, if you want me to be." Sorrel's chest tightened. She had spent so many years being told who she was, what she should do, where she belonged. And now, standing in her cafe, her sanctuary, she realized that for once, her answer belonged entirely to her. She lifted her hand, brushing her fingers lightly against his. It was the smallest gesture, but in it was the freedom she had fought to claim. Cassian didn't seize the moment, didn't pull her closer. He waited, still, patient, until she tilted her face toward him. The kiss was soft, unhurried, and certain. No conquest, no demand. Just a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had built together, trust, respect, and a love rooted in shared work and gentle strength. When they parted, Sorrel's smile trembled, but it was real. For the first time, she felt as though the world ahead of her wasn't something to endure, it was something to create. And to the viewers of her story, a final thought lingered. If Sorrel's choice inspired you, share this story, subscribe, and join me for more tales that remind us. Sometimes choosing yourself is the bravest story of all.